tavern by the fire, we sing of Randall's smile. Its wisdom like the starlit skies guide you through the night. With harp in hand and tales unfold, the legends sing their flight of dragons and enchanted lands where shadows turn to light. Oh, grand elf brave, we sing your name.
So the Rings of Power is behind us, right? But I'm not done talking about it because I think, well, not because I think that this series can be fixed necessarily. I think that we're probably doomed to 3 more terrible seasons, because really the only way to fix this show is to end the show and start over with a brand new series about the Second Age, helmed by people who are experienced and have a real affinity for and affection for and understanding of Tolkien's actual work. The people that are in charge of this, J.D. Payne, Patrick McKay, are clearly too inexperienced to craft a compelling story, or to handle something this big, this much scope and scale and money and the huge cast, which I'll get to in a minute. I just don't think they're up for the job. And I think that, you know, we talk a lot about things being overly woke or designed for the modern audience. And I don't think that this show is particularly woke, because I don't think that this series actually has much of a philosophical core to it. It really doesn't really say anything about anything. The most you can say in terms of like the modern audience is that it's very racially diverse, which is pretty much done in a way that's colorblind and tokenistic rather than in a sort of narrative fashion. And I think that that's ultimately kind of condescending to minorities and women, but that's another story for another time. I think the problems with this show is that it's designed for an audience that doesn't really have a strong sense of either Tolkien and his lore and the works surrounding Lord of the Rings. And it's not really designed for people who care about a good story in the first place. It's not even good generic fantasy. It's really just very pretty, very expensive, cheap fantasy. I mean, that's the weird thing, is that it's so cheaply written, but it's so expensive to make. So that's sort of the weird dichotomy that we have with the Rings of Power, in that it sort of comes across as like a lower tier fantasy series you might watch in the 90s, but with a huge budget. So I wrote a piece about the 5 biggest problems with season 2 of The Rings of Power. And a lot of these problems are the exact same problems that we encountered in season 1. Now, 5 is a small number, right? And I kind of grouped some things together here, but I'll go over these real quickly. And obviously there are so many more, but I think these are kind of the broad strokes problems. And so problem number 1 is that the changes to the lore, the changes to the source material, are done for no reason, right? Okay, so I am not someone who says that we should have a perfect one-to-one adaptation of source material when it comes to really anything. For one thing, when it comes to the Second Age of Tolkien's Middle-earth, you can't really do a one-to-one adaptation because it's thousands of years, right? It's thousands of years of story, and it's not like a novel like The Lord of the Rings, right? It's like history. So you have to condense that. You have to pick and choose what you're going to tell. You have to flesh stuff out. You have to give, certain characters more character. You have to give them dialogue, right? There's a lot that has to go into this, and it's no small task. It's a much more difficult task in a lot of ways than adapting, the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, the Return of the King, because yeah, there's just so much there, and you have to figure out, okay, what are we going to tell? What parts of this story? What original characters are we going to introduce? Which, what are we going to put the focus on? It's difficult, and I don't envy the task. I just think the people that were set to this task were way out of their depth. So the changes don't make sense, though. This is the problem. If you're going to make changes, if you accept that changes must be made, because you're taking something and putting it in a new medium, so obviously something has to change. Those changes should serve the purpose of the original text, right? It should serve the purpose of taking that text and putting it onto the screen. So I totally understand why you'd want to condense the timeline to some degree, but I think they've done it in a really haphazard way that has fundamentally hurt the nature of the story itself. I've said this before, but I think the first couple of seasons should have been all about the forging of the rings, the deception of Anatar, the way he tricks. He doesn't trick Gil-galad or Galadriel, but he does trick Celebrimbor and the Elven Smiths, and eventually these 2 seasons would culminate in Sauron forging the One Ring, and coming back to Eregion, sacking Eregion, torturing and killing Celebrimbor, who refuses to give up the location of the 3 Elven Rings. You could do all this, you wouldn't have to, you could do all this and show that a great deal of time is passing, because it does take hundreds of years for all of that to happen. But you wouldn't have to, stretch it out and make it slow. There are ways to condense the timeline or to show the passage of time that makes sense in this context. And obviously, like, a lot of time could just pass off screen, but you could convey that, right? And then you have the fall of Numenor. For the next couple seasons, you show, how powerful Numenor is, how mighty that nation is, how overwhelmed Sauron's forces are by the armies of Numenor and Ar-Pharazôn, and eventually then the corruption, the worshipping of Morgoth, and all of that leads to the downfall of Numenor. And then finally you could have the last alliance of men and elves in the 5th season, and the temporary defeat of Sauron, and Isildur's decision then, his own fall from grace, when instead of destroying the ring, he takes it for himself. Great way to end the series. Maybe that's how they will end the series, but obviously they're getting there in a very strange way, which is to take all these thousands of years and put them into one timeline that exists over months, maybe a couple years, and have, Isildur and Elendil be contemporaries of Celebrimbor. And this hurts the story. It also hurts the story because a lot of the chronology is messed up. It's not just condensed, but things are turned around. For instance, having the Elven Ring, the 3 rings forged first, makes no sense. It doesn't fit the story, because in the story, Celebrimbor forges those without Sauron present, while Sauron forges the One Ring in secret himself. So these are all forged in secret, and that's a great dramatic thing to have included in this story. Because you kind of, you go from Anatar working with the elves to then the suspicion, and then them both, going separately their own ways, and then Sauron coming back. You also just have 2, and I guess this is a good time to go into point number 2. I mean, there's lots of other changes to the source material that we could go over, but it'd just take way too long. The point is, the changes don't make sense. Not that there are changes, but they don't make sense. This also leads to problem number 2, which is that there are too many characters and too many storylines going on at once. And sometimes this can work. I will point to Game of Thrones as a TV show based on books that has a lot of characters and storylines. And for a few seasons, they are able to present this in a way that is digestible and easy to follow and entertaining, right? We can follow all these different storylines and all these different characters because it's well crafted. It's a well crafted series that follows the books very closely. And then when the series goes downhill is very similar to when the source material goes downhill, in my view. It's not just when the source material runs out that Game of Thrones falls apart, but it starts to weaken, both because of changes they make from the books, but also because I think Martin's books start to get worse in book number 4. He simply introduces too many point of view characters, and it becomes this crazy task. As a reader, it becomes difficult to follow. As a viewer, the show becomes unwieldy also, and I'm sure that George R.R. Martin is having a hell of a time finishing Winds of Winter and this series because he has simply gotten out of control. There are too many characters and too many storylines. Some things are better left kind of off screen, including stuff in books, right? Like, you don't need to tell all these different stories in point of view chapters. You can have things happen that people hear about. Anyways, that's a different show. That's a different book series, but it's a good point, I think, a good comparison, because it's really hard. It's really hard to manage and juggle so many storylines and so many characters. And this show is simply not up to the task. And so we have stuff like Valandil, right? The death of Valandil, this character in Numenor, who we have barely gotten to know and certainly don't care about, but it's presented as this horrible tragedy when he's killed by Kemen. I can't believe I'm remembering these names right now. Or Rian, the elven archer who's given Boromir's death. She barely has 3 lines in the whole show, and then she gets this big dramatic death. And you have to follow the hobbits or the Harfoots. And then there's the Stoors introduced. And you've got a new villain in the Dark Wizard. You've got all the Numenorean politics, which are totally ridiculous. You have to follow all of this stuff, as well as the Dwarven squabbling and the Elven squabbling, and then the core of the story, which is Anatar and Celebrimbor. And oddly enough, happens to be the best part of Season 2. If they had simply followed the source material more closely and not introduced so many different moving pieces, I think this show would be a lot more entertaining because we could focus a little bit more on the stories that mattered. And this leads us to our next problem, which is the lack of attention to detail and plausibility. And I'm going to throw in this section also all the callbacks and member berries, because I feel like this weakness in writing is not just a lack of attention to detail, to plausibility, but also this reliance on the crutch that are Easter eggs and callbacks to Lord of the Rings and lines just pulled directly from Lord of the Rings or from Harry Potter, as it happens. But there's just so many things like Disa in the dwarven city of Khazad-dûm, having the ball she purchases in the market, the little orb, roll into a cavern that is just 50 feet away from this bustling market, but no one's ever been there. Or like Durin the Third, mining through this flimsy wall of stones that feel like they've been piled up, and on the other side is a huge cavern that no one has ever found before. And that's where the Balrog is. And, there's all these little things that just sort of defy plausibility. And people are always like, well, it's a fantasy with dragons and orcs. Why do you care about plausibility? But again, it goes back to that word, verisimilitude, which means which is effectively our ability to accept the internal logic of a fantasy or fictional world, right? Our ability to suspend our disbelief. And I've brought up examples, like we'll go back to Game of Thrones. If Jon Snow just showed up at the end in wearing a jetpack and shooting a laser gun to defeat Daenerys, I think a lot of people would say that's bullshit. And you'd still have defenders of the show saying, oh, you think having a laser gun and a jetpack in a show with dragons is bad? It's like, well, yeah, I do think that sort of breaks our immersion in the story. And there's so many things like that in Season 2 of Rings of Power. Adar and his orc army just sort of appearing at Eregion, somehow dragging these huge siege engines hundreds of miles from Mordor all the way there. And it's just like, okay, this actually doesn't make sense. This makes no more sense than sending Elrond and Galadriel on foot to Eregion when they could sail a ship or take horses. It's almost like they introduced slow travel all of a sudden when they've been just happily doing fast travel the whole time. And then having, Tom Bombadil just not act at all like Tom Bombadil, but be like Yoda, the Yoda of Lord of the Rings. And then, again, this gets to these callbacks. Gandalf, not Gandalf, he is Gandalf, Grandalf, whatever, is swallowed by this tree, and Bombadil saves him. And it's just this callback, this stolen scene from Fellowship of the Ring when the hobbits are devoured by Old Man Willow, and Bombadil saves them. So there's just tons and tons of stuff like that throughout the season. And every single time it happens, whether it's a callback or fast travel or characters just doing bizarre things like taking the 3 elven rings like 50 feet out into the ocean to drop them in the ocean, or an eagle showing up and that convincing all the Numenorians that Alfarazon is the rightful ruler, and then switching that decision the next week with this big giant squid, and then switching that decision again with this scroll about Sauron. These things tear us out of the story, and they're just lazy. All of this stuff could be just so much better handled if they actually cared about their scripts. But I don't think they do, because this is being made for the TikTok generation. This is being made for people who post memes and who get really excited about Sauron and Galadriel being shipped as a romantic couple. There was even an article in the Mary Sue that I thought about making a video. I might still make a video about it, but it's talking about how the shipping of Galadriel and Sauron actually improves Tolkien's story, which I don't even know if people actually believe the shit that they say. I think it's all so much just rage bait. The fourth problem is the dialogue, and I want to just read little bits of it. I think the most offensive dialogue in the show, which manages somehow to be very wooden and like people just making these sort of wooden proclamations at each other, but also florid and overly dramatic at the same time. It's like they're trying really hard to sound like Tolkien, but they forget how people are supposed to talk to each other in real life. Like, people are supposed to have conversations, not just make proclamations at each other all the time. Galadriel might be the worst at this. She's constantly proclaiming at other people, proclaiming what's happening, in these dire tones. And it never sounds like actual people talking with one another. And this is just a failure of the writer's ability to craft believable dialogue. And their attempt to sound Tolkien-esque that just completely misses the mark. For instance, there's a scene when Galadriel and Celebrimbor reunite in Eregion during the battle. Now, there's a pitched battle going on. A whole bunch of crazy shit's happening all around them. And Celebrimbor wants Galadriel to take the 9 rings and run away with them. And he's going to buy her time by going back to hold off Sauron. And he says, "But perhaps the elves need only remember that it is not strength that overcomes darkness, but light." Now, right there, that's not a bad line. I don't mind that line. If he had said that and then turned around and rushed off to stop Sauron, okay, I wouldn't even think twice. Like, okay, good for you. But he goes on because they want to show some montage of the battle and says, "Armies may rise, hearts may fail, yet still light endures, and is mightier than strength, for in its presence all darkness must flee." Now, mind you, this is spoken very slowly over a montage while Galadriel sort of stares at him like, "Hurry up, old man." Like, come on. She gives him a look that's sort of like after Elrond kisses her, which is another faux pas in this series. But it's this idea that people are speechifying to each other all the time for a montage. And the worst example is Poppy at the end in the finale while they show scenes of all the other stuff going on. Elrond looking back at the burning city of Eregion, Elendil riding on his horse. All the different characters are shown during this montage while Poppy gives this, I would say it's the exact opposite of an inspiring speech. She says, "After my family, Mr. Burroughs sat me down, told me some things can't be fixed. Some things lost are lost forever. No matter how hard we fight, how much it hurts, or how much our hearts yearn to put them back together, 'cause this world's so much bigger than any of us. And sometimes the winds blowing against us are just too strong. At those times, Mr. Burroughs said, we've just got to accept it. What's broke is broke and won't fix, and all anybody can do is try and build something new." I tell you, the Harfoot philosophy is so messed up because, they have that, like, nobody walks alone chant, but then they just leave people behind. And here Mr. Burroughs is telling Poppy, like, don't fight. Don't struggle. Don't do anything to make it better. Just give up. Just give up. It's the weirdest speech. And Poppy hasn't earned a speech. She's a nothing character. She's done nothing. Like, she shouldn't even be in this season. Nori and Gandalf left the Harfoot. She was supposed to look after the whole Harfoot tribe, but she just bails and joins them, and basically they give her a Sam speech, but a bad one, over a montage. And there were worse speeches in season 1 even. Bronwyn's little inspiring speech is and the thing she used to tell Theo and all that stuff. It's so cringy. It's so cringy. Anyways, this kind of dialogue, these kind of proclamations and speeches are peppered throughout. And it gives you the sense that none of these characters are real. I mean, in some ways, the dwarves and the hobbits actually have the most conversational tones. But even then, like, the problem with the Hobbit storyline is it just goes nowhere and it doesn't matter at all. And then the dwarves, the frustrating thing there is that they're always arguing. They're always arguing, and Disa is always right, which is another issue that I won't even get into, but it's crazy how they've created this character who just is always right about everything, and can scare hardened dwarven miners with bats using her song. Anyways, the point is there's just tons and tons of bad dialogue littered throughout, and it creates a sense that none of these characters are real people who actually have relationships with one another. And that gets us to our last point, which is that there are no stakes in this show. There are no stakes. There is no tension. For one thing, it's a prequel problem. We know that Elrond and Galadriel survive. We know what happens with the fall of Sauron and Isildur. We know the big things that are going to happen because they all happen before The Lord of the Rings. But this show doesn't do a very good job of giving us new stakes to care about or fleshing out these stories in ways that are compelling. They have a lot of original characters, but they've only killed off characters that we really don't care about. They have a character like Arondir, who would have been a great choice to have that dramatic death in the Battle of Eregion, but the death is given to a nothing character like Rian instead. Arondir, meanwhile, is stabbed in the chest or the gut. So, he's given a mortal wound by Adar, and by the next episode, he is just fine. They don't show him being healed by any rings. He's just like, 'twas but a scratch. Off I go again. So there's no stakes, there's no tension, and this results in something that is pretty to look at and very, very boring. You'd think that maybe making changes to the source material would keep us on our toes a little bit, because we're like, hey, well, they've changed a bunch of stuff, so I wonder what's going to happen. But the things that do happen are just goofy, like the sword fight between Galadriel and Sauron at the end is just goofy. I was honestly chuckling throughout the whole thing, mostly because of the facial expressions that Galadriel was making. She looked like an angry badger or chipmunk. I have to say, Charlie Vickers is a great actor. He's doing a great job with the script he's been given, but it really shows when he's acting across from Morfydd Clark, who, hate to say it, she's just not up for the job. She just doesn't work as Galadriel. She might be a perfectly fine actor in a different context, a different role, but here, she's just so bad. I wanted to so those are my 5 kind of big, all-encompassing problems, but then I was on Twitter and I was having a little conversation with fantasy author Garth Nix, who wrote in a reply to my tweet, I might add the complete absence of any sense of the Numinous, which is so significant in the books, and clearly Jackson and Boyens understood this for the films. So the Numinous, that's a great word, and one I haven't heard in a while, but the definition is having a strong religious or spiritual quality, indicating or suggesting the presence of a divinity, right? So yeah, Tolkien was a very religious Catholic, conservative Catholic. He was such a conservative Catholic that he was pretty pissed when they stopped doing Latin Mass. He would go to church and he would say everything in Latin loudly in protest of the English Mass. But his books are filled with the Numinous, right? There is a very strong sense of religiosity and of a greater power and of a divinity. And this show, because it's made for modern audiences, dispenses with all of that. And everything feels a little pettier and a little less grand. And, this gets also to the sense of like good versus evil. They're trying so hard to make us sympathize with Sauron and the orcs. And, there is a place for that in modern fantasy or in any good stories. There's a place where we, are meant to sympathize with bad guys, right? Breaking Bad is such a successful show because it does such a good job at that, or The Sopranos. All kinds of stuff out there. And I'm not against that in fantasy, but it's just not this fantasy, right? This is not... Lord of the Rings isn't meant to ship Galadriel and Sauron. That is not an interesting story to put into Lord of the Rings, where there is supposed to be true evil. And the corruption of evil is very, very, very present. And I just find the lack of that is startling. I don't know that they have the skill even to add a sense of the divine to this show, but it badly needs it, because this is an epic fantasy of the struggle between good and evil, and not a story of shades of gray, of morally complex characters. I mean, I think that there's some room for that, and Tolkien does have morally complex characters. Absolutely. Boromir, for instance, is a great example. But making like Galadriel tempted by Sauron because she has the hots for him is ridiculous. Much more interesting to put something like that into Celebrimbor and his pride and how his pride blinds him to the truth. I mean, that's a great example of how you can have something like that in Tolkien or in Rings of Power that's actually Tolkien-esque. But without having a strong sense of the Numinous, how do you really capture that on screen? And how do you do the fall of Numenor without having this sense that this is a civilization that is grand and wonderful and beyond anything else in the world, because we need it to fall from that height. And as it stands, they're just a bunch of petty, bigoted, backwater idiots, right? And so that loss of something grander and bigger and holier and more sacred should be permeating this show, but it's nowhere to be found. So those are kind of the big problems with The Rings of Power in season 2, most of which I could literally make this about season 1, and all of the same things would be there. We just didn't have Gandalf yet. We didn't have confirmation, and he hadn't found his staff. I was watching the most recent Charlie Hopkinson video. He does the Gandalf roast videos, and he has Gandalf at the end talk about how they're next time they're going to do the story of how he finds his pointy hat. And it's so silly, but it's like, maybe I could see season 3, the Nori Gandalf storyline. They're off to find his hat. And what character will they bring in for that? Maybe the Sorting Hat from Harry Potter. Anyways, thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave a comment. Let me know what your biggest problems with this show were. Or, contrarily, if you think I'm full of shit, have at me. I have gotten a lot of abuse over my reviews of this show, but not a lot of people who actually want to defend it on its own merits. So if you want to do that, I will be impressed. Anyways, thanks for watching. Peace.
In the stone halls where shadows creep, Gandalf's wisdom vast and deep is staff aglow with ancient light, guides the light with gentle might, gentle